on how we know each other. I guess it's my appointment at Pompidou. That was 7 years ago.
Yeah.
7 years ago? You never met before?
No.
No.
But I think MoMA is one of the strongest, biggest partners, right?
For sure. We've been working together closely, at least for the last 7 years. And
are you in regular contact? Like you meet once every month, every
Coming to New York maybe 5-6 times a year.
So you meet at least once every 2 months?
Yeah. And if it's not, in person, it's over some issue via email or letters. But we probably do more projects with the Pompidou than we do with any other museum in the world.
Oh yeah, even the Tate?
Well, the Tate would be the next.
Next one.
Same thing with us.
Same thing. So that's the most natural partner for the Pompidou is the MoMA.
That's because those collections are so strong. So we're constantly borrowing from each other. And I see the MoMA has always been very generous to us.
Vice versa.
And do you think that your museums, via their collections and their choices of temporary exhibitions, are saying the same things about art history?
I don't know if I'd say they were saying the same things because they have, in the end, different mandates and different audiences. We're a private institution, not a public one. The New York audience has an overlap with the Parisian audience, but we don't carry the same weight in terms of national expectations as a place like the Centre Pompidou. So I suspect we tell similar, but in the end, different histories. That would be my guess. I don't know whether.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you will have, you speak from a certain standpoint, and so you always have a certain focus, like with the National Museum of Modern Art in France. So we're expecting to have the best collection of French artists and to show obviously more French artists in our exhibition program than the MoMA would ever do. But we look at what the MoMA does very closely, and it's constantly thinking, oh, look what they're showing in the display of the permanent collection or in the photography gallery. They dug this work out of their storage and it's on display, and that means something. It's constantly, it's constant challenge, and we're constantly trying to get new ideas from watching what the MoMA does. It's an inspiration, definitely.
We do the same thing. In fact, we looked so closely that last year we hired a great curator from the Centre Pompidou, Quentin Bajac. I mean, seriously, it's because...
The first successful attempt.
Yes. I had tried several times before. Yeah. I was 0 for 4, I think. And finally, thanks to Quentin, at least I had one small success. But it's because...
But it's a great coach.
Yeah. But it's because when we look at who's doing interesting exhibitions, one of the first places we look to, and I don't just mean temporary exhibitions, who's doing interesting work with the collection, with installations, with exhibitions, it's natural that we look at what the Centre Pompidou is doing, and every once in a while you see somebody who's doing something so well, you hope that you can convince them to help you as well.
And is there some MoMA curators working now at Pompidou Center? Did it happen on the same?
I don't think we could compete in terms of salary, unfortunately. I would love to.
You can certainly compete in terms of city.
Glenn, if you had to be the director of the Pompidou Center, and Alain, if you were the director of the MoMA, what do you think would be the biggest difference? What would you feel really like the biggest difference between this job and the job you had before?
Well, when I look at the Centre Pompidou, what I see is really a cultural complex, right? It's the library, it's the Cinematheque, it's the museum, it's all of the activity that happens around it. It's a much bigger and more complicated responsibility than what we have here. We're like a slice of what falls under the aegis of the Pompidou, and we don't have a national mandate, and that gives us, on the one hand, a certain kind of freedom, but it also means that we can never attain the level of national importance that a place like the Centre Pompidou has.
I think there's a whole part of Glenn's job that is talking to the trustees and convincing the owners to raising money. I'll have to do it obviously, but it's more towards corporate sponsors, and I've got one big shareholder who is the state, and so I'm constantly talking with the government, which obviously it would be a major difference between the French and American museum, the balance of power.
You both had articles recently in national newspapers, Glenn in the New York Times, Alain in Le Monde, that were both saying about the same things, the same complaints, about being popular, elitist, to have to do a range of activities which becomes to be like a crazy one. And how do you manage how do you deal with the pressure on your shoulder? Do you feel that you are more and more asked to do as if you were God on earth?
I think museums are usually successful, and especially these two museums are extremely successful museums. So it's not surprising that there is a very strong social demand that is addressed to the museum. That obviously necessarily generates frustration because there's so much is invested into.
But do you think there's more and more pressure, or is it has been like that for? Maybe Alain, you have a.
No, there's always been. I mean, you're always torn between. You always have to reconcile being contemporary, so that means cutting edge. That means difficult. That means not extremely popular, and on the other hand, generate revenues, raise attendance, reach out towards broader audiences. And these two terms of the equation, how do you reconcile them, is what running a contemporary museum is about.
Any great museum, and especially a museum that deals with contemporary culture, that isn't controversial, that isn't at the center of a debate, is not doing its job well. It's not about being loved. It's about being engaged, and you can't be involved with contemporary culture without being involved in controversial issues, without being engaged in the debate of where does popular culture end and art begin, between reaching out to a broad audience, which is after all part of a democratic vision of museums that are open and accessible to different audiences, but also focused and concentrated for those who are deeply engaged in the art world. So all these tensions have been around for a long time. And we at the Museum of Modern Art have been criticized and praised and criticized again almost since our founding. And I see it as just part of the job, that if everybody feels you're doing something, doesn't matter, good or bad, if people don't line up in competing directions, then you're not engaging your audiences. So it just comes with the territory, and you just have to sort of recognize that you cannot be all things to all people, but you can actually be a place that's very interesting and that compels people to think about what it means to be a museum, what it means to be involved in art today.
Recently, in one of the talks that we had these last days, someone said that there's a big difference between France and America. It's that in America, art is common, and in France, art is precious. What do you think about that?
I'm not sure longer. Does it longer price?
I don't think so.
This distinction between art and low cultures.
It was more a comment about the fact that because in France art is precious, it becomes something like you have to deal with it in a way which is much more complicated than in the US. I think it was the sense of.
Well, they're so different, really. But it depends. I think it depends whether you're talking about the idea of art at some national level or at an individual level. So at a national level, there's a very big difference between the way Americans view and understand art and the way the French view and understand art. So art is part of a cultural patrimony. It's perceived as being incredibly important to the way any individual in France understands his or her position as somebody participating in the larger culture of their country. Here, art is not seen as an essential dimension of what it means to be an American. No American would sit down and say, oh, art is integral to who we as Americans are. At some national level, of course, at an individual level, some people love art and collect it and some people don't, but it isn't, the politic of art isn't considered in the same way. And maybe that's what was meant by that distinction between precious and common, that you can't have a conversation in France about patrimony and national identity that doesn't involve art. Whereas you wouldn't have that conversation.
I would have said the contrary. I mean, I would have said that in France art is common because it is a matter of public interest.
Yeah.
As you said, I mean, it is a political thing in the best sense of the word. Yeah?
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Art Square.